Well, I am thrilled that we have a class in the School of Family Life about writing. Thrilled about it, and for a lot of reasons. I have loved studying family. I was asked to just describe a little bit of my own history in getting into the study of family as a professor and what that meant. And it's a really interesting story. It's not typical, but I think probably lots of people have atypical stories, but we think it was atypical. But my undergraduate at BYU was in nursing, and I was sure I wanted to be a nurse. And I learned a lot. In fact, that nursing training was really, really good for my brain. And during that experience of studying it and working as a nurse, as a pediatric nurse just for a year, I learned a lot about the power of families in the health and well-being of children. And really that it came down, a lot of health issues really centered around both the healing of them and the causing of them centered around family. And by the time I'd finished my nursing degree, I wanted to do something different. I felt like I should do something different. I was sure I was going to kill people as a nurse, to be honest. But I pursued a master's degree in linguistics to prepare to be a teacher of English to speakers of other languages, so ESL training. And what was fascinating in linguistics is, again, that same experience of seeing the power of family, the influence of family on children's language development, on their academic development. And so as I was teaching for that department and learning more about language and well-being, family was again a central piece. Then during that experience while I was teaching ESL for BYU, I was invited by a dear friend to go to what was called the World Congress of Families in Geneva, Switzerland. And of course I was delighted to go to Switzerland. And during that conference, which involved an NGO, those are non-governmental organizations that lobby at the United Nations, this NGO was focused on highlighting how science demonstrated the significant role of family in the well-being of nations, in the well-being of communities, and of course individual well-being. And I was floored by what I heard. I heard religious perspectives, I heard scientific perspectives, I heard philosophical perspectives about the family. And at the time I was teaching ESL, and I just thought that was amazing. That was so remarkable to get a new window into the power of family, and didn't really think that it would change my career, but it ended up doing that. And by the time I'd finished teaching ESL for a specified 3-year period as a faculty member, my dad said, "Jenna, I think you ought to get a PhD." And I was like, no. At that time, we didn't have the internet and very developed, and I felt like thousands of hours in the library studying to write the thesis for my master's degree, and I just thought, I know what that's all about. I don't want to get a PhD. But within just a few months, I could feel that was definitely what heaven wanted. And the doors just opened. I took some courses at BYU in preparation to apply for a PhD program in family science. And of course, I didn't have a degree in family science, so I didn't have any idea how that would pan out. But the faculty at BYU were so helpful, and doors really opened. I think as women in particular, we make contingency plans about life. If this, then this, and if not this, then this. And I learned a lot during those years about trusting really one step enough, and watching some doors close and other doors just gape open, even if I had not anticipated them or desired them per se. But that PhD experience, I went to the University of Minnesota, and I worked with a wonderful professor, Bill Doherty, who writes a lot about the intentional family and is a fantastic therapist and researcher. And he was a wonderful mentor that again built so much and expanded my understanding of the important role of family in the well-being of society and individuals. So then I got to come teach at BYU. But prior to that, I had an experience as a research fellow in Washington, D.C. I'd always been interested in government and policy to some degree, and it worked out that I could be at an institution there in Washington, D.C. and do research as a scientist, as a fellow, doing family science research. And my specific focus that they asked me to, they gave me some directions, and then they asked me to hone in on the effects of daycare on children's development, and what we knew from a scientific perspective about daycare. And so I just started Googling research, and it was just a remarkable experience. It's the experience you're having doing doing research and honing in on a topic and doing a literature review. That's what I did, only it was 500 studies or something that I needed to look at. And while I was there, I saw this interesting gap that no one had talked about in any of my PhD work or as a student at BYU, this gap between what information policymakers were using to make policy and what academics were doing in their research. And my job was to kind of close that gap. So we have all these academics doing research on children's well-being and what daycare does and what that means. And then I needed to look at all that data and find out what that meant for policy. Should we start, a national daycare project? Should we advocate for that or not? What are the risks? What are the benefits? And I could see, wow, I'm learning all of these things in school as a PhD student. And it seems like it's really hard to get that information to where it can impact society. And what an opportunity to see that gap. And what it did for me is when I started teaching at BYU, I never lost that desire to be involved in shaping the story that was being told in society. People will say, whoever writes the story shapes society. If it's Hollywood that's writing the story of our culture, that's what shapes culture. If it's writers, the New York Times that are writing, they shape the culture. And I could tell people in the lay world need to know what we know in family science and what we know from the truths that we've been given as members of the Church of Jesus Christ. And that was an important role that I had. And so during that time period, as I got married miraculously and we started having children, a wonderful man, Paul Edwards, who I met through a totally different thing. I was serving on the board of a private school at the time, and he just said, Janet, would you write for the Deseret News? We need a columnist, and this way he described it, we need a columnist who will put science together with the issues that are concerning society around family. And we just need a scientific perspective, and we need someone who has your grounding in why family matters so much to write. And I had no idea how to write for that. I'd never really spent a lot of time reading editorial pieces. So it was a whole new invitation. And what it started was just a learning about how I would find out about a topic and then how I would write about it for that audience. And sometimes Paul Edwards would give me an assignment. He'd say, we're in the Romney campaign and Mitt Romney's made this comment and it's making a big deal. Can you write about this from a woman's perspective and from a family science perspective? Or we've got this issue that has to do with same-sex marriage. Can you write about this and how that deals with policy? And sometimes he would give me the topic. Sometimes it would have to do with what was going on, like the Me Too campaign. That's a big deal. And so what would I offer in a 600 to 700 word editorial about that? And what I found is, first of all, my husband is a fantastic help because he's been a great reader of news and good writing. But I learned, first of all, that I needed to not spend so much time watching TV or trying to search, read the New York Times every day or read whatever newspaper every day. But I needed to find sources that I trusted who would do good analysis of family science and study those and the things that interested me, and it felt like, wow, this is really valuable science, and we need more of the people around us in our culture to know those truths that have been shared through this scientific research. And that was the best way for me to prepare. And it's been very interesting to feel heaven's direction in what to write about. I think what I'm thinking about, what I'm worried about as a mother, then that can kind of be a guide for what seems for that month. I just write a monthly column. For that month seems to be most compelling. And then I'll just study it out and find good sources on that material and then draw on my own experience to write about it. I think it's really interesting that when we're writing about things, there's science, right? We have the scientific findings that we have, and often science bears out what we actually feel to be true, which is interesting. What the truths that we've been given we'll see often play out in science, of course, naturally. But they require a particular perspective, probably gained by wisdom and experience, that you can take that science and hopefully be a voice for truth in that particular topic. I've thought a lot about, one thing I've thought a lot about is the role of women in this effort to write, and feelings about just learning to be a good writer. I remember as a graduate student, I heard a talk from Elder Eyring. I was in my car listening to this talk he'd given at BYU Idaho long years before, and he was teaching his students about Section 25 of the Doctrine and Covenants, this teaching to Emma. And there's instruction to Emma about writing, being a writer. And he honed in on it, and he talked to his women students specifically about developing the capacity to be articulate writers. And as I was listening to him, my mind was so expanded with why God wants us to learn to be articulate, that he cares about that. He cares about us because the process of learning to be articulate, and we're all beginners at it, it requires us honing in on truth that really matters. And it requires us to learn by experience those truths for ourselves, and to really discern what is important about this issue. That's why it's really important to learn that. I think he cares about us learning to be articulate. And there's so many different spheres where that capacity or that effort to be articulate can be used. First, at home. And he gave a beautiful example of a mother writing a letter to her son, that this son, it was a beautiful story, but his son describes it as scripture to him. It was a letter from his mother. And of course, we know Adam and Eve were given instructions early on to keep a book of remembrance, a collection of writings of the truths that they had learned, both by experience and directly from heaven. And so as he talked about that, and as I thought about it, I could see we need those skills in our homes. That's really important. And women also, and men, are needed in their communities. That capacity to be articulate is desperately needed in their communities. My professor, Bill Doherty, would talk about Jane Addams, a woman who had done a great deal in her community in Chicago, probably during the late 1800s into the 1900s. And her mantra was, a woman needs 1 foot in the home and 1 foot in her community. Now, there are different seasons of your life when that takes on different meaning. But I think what it does testify of, that Elder Eyring was also teaching, is that the skills that we develop as mothers, mothering, as fathers, fathering, are needed in our communities. The truths that we learn from that experience are needed in our communities. Our skills that we develop as students and as scholars are needed in our communities, because our voices, the truths we've been given, are needed to better shape, to make this a better world for people to live in. So I felt strongly about the power and importance of women's voices, and men's as well, but thinking of my own experience as a woman, in caring about the developing of those skills of articulateness and learning how to communicate well with others, the truths that we are learning and being taught and have been given. I have seen that play out in many different ways. One woman I mentioned to Julie, a good friend, called a couple months ago and said, there's this difficult thing happening at the library, at our public library, and I don't know what to do. I want to change it. I think families care about it, and it's serious, and it affects our children. And I said, you need to write about it. You need to call the newspaper. This will be something that they need to hear about, and you write an op-ed about this. And I realized in thinking about this course, you are being prepared to become articulate voices that can help shape the world for your own children and for the world's children and for others, and how important that role is, that it started with the capacity to articulate truths and defend them. Now, having said that, one of the things I've really appreciated, my husband comes from a very different background than myself. I grew up in a big family, big conservative family, and long pioneer heritage, and he comes from an entirely different family. He's an only child, divorced parents, a wonderful background because of its uniqueness and what he's learned from it. But I found that that his experiences help me to shape the tone or my efforts in the way that I write so that I can reach people beyond my own perspective. And I have felt so much that the gospel of Jesus Christ teaches us that very thing. And if we will look to our leaders and how they articulate beliefs, we will find that the tone that they use is a Christ-like tone. It's one that is unwavering in its commitment to God and the truths that lead to happiness, and unwavering in its commitment to love and reaching all of God's children. So it's been so remarkable both to have my husband's perspective, who knows how others that I might not have grown up around might feel about something, and the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ to help us speak in ways that are inclusive and also unwavering in their commitment to what we know leads to happiness. And we have a special mission. I think we have a special mission to share our beliefs, to learn to articulate them in that way, with that tone, with that unwavering commitment to truth. So I hope all of you will have a great experience writing, learning to be good writers, believing that it matters, that it's important. It's important in your own families, and it's important outside of your families. And it includes a whole range of different types of formats, from op-eds to just writing to friends, to expressing yourself in social media in a brief paragraph, to writing in your journal and keeping a record for your family, to writing op-eds, I think I mentioned, and searching literature and learning how to condense information. All of those skills are so valuable in ways you can't anticipate. So I'm glad you get this class.